Hi, everyone. I think we are live, which is very exciting. Good to see all of you joining. As we get started here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in just a second. But if you want to say hello in the chat, I would love that. Feel free to share your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. Would love to just get to see everybody who's here. And I will go ahead and share my screen right now. I know we only have, a short amount of time together, and we've got a lot of content to cover. So I will probably be faster and less interactive than I usually am. If you've worked with me before in another workshop, I saw some folks, familiar faces on the list of attendees. So if you're one of those and you know that normally we are very interactive, just know that I am going to try to get through a lot of content today, and very excited to talk about this very important topic. So outcomes for our session today. So really, honestly, mostly want to make sure that everybody walks away understanding and really getting some high impact strategies. And we're going to talk a little bit about how crisis just in general shifts your employee value proposition as an organization, and then explore some concrete resources. So again, lots of content to cover. I'll keep an eye on the time. We may not get to everything, but the whole PowerPoint will be uploaded onto the resources section of the presentation, and then you can always get in touch with me afterwards if you need any help accessing the information. The other thing I'll name is that there's a 15-second delay between when I'm saying something and when you all hear it. So I am going to ask for you guys to participate in the chat, but I'll probably pause for a longer time than might feel normal just to get some responses in, and might move forward as chat responses are coming in as well. Okay, so our agenda, and then we can jump in. So we're going to talk first about just some retention bottom lines. We'll go into that idea of how crisis shifts EVP just in general. And if you don't know what an EVP is, no worries. We will go over what that is in that section. We'll talk through some strategies, and then I'm going to add in a quick note just about management during crisis as well. And then we'll close out, and I will be available to answer any questions from there. The thing I'll name is this session is absolutely geared mostly towards school leaders as well as operations and talent folks. So if you are in a different role in an organization, that is totally fine. Welcome. Really excited to have you. Just know that a lot of the information is geared towards leadership and helping organizational leaders or talent leaders figure out how to manage retention in a more systematic way. Okay, so I'm going to start us off trying to be a little interactive through a poll, quick check-in. So I'm going to launch the poll in just a second, but the poll question is, how concerned are you right now about teacher retention for this upcoming year? So there's going to be 4 options for you to choose from. I'm going to give everybody about 30 seconds to answer it before the poll closes, and I'm going to go ahead and send it out right now. So go ahead and take a second and choose how concerned you are about teacher retention, and then I will publish the results as soon as the poll closes in 30 seconds. You have about 15 more seconds, it looks like. Go ahead and click your answers. About 5 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like, and you all should be able to see the poll results as well, but if not, I'll read them out loud. It looks like we're actually pretty divided in here. We've got about 1/3 of people saying that they're somewhat concerned, about 1/3 of people saying experiencing the same amount of concern, and then we've got about 17% each on the I'm not concerned, and then I'm very concerned. So we're all over the map, which makes sense. Different contexts have a different level of need when it comes to teacher retention. Hopefully you'll be able to walk away with something that works for you after today's content. And for those of you who are very concerned, you can always reach out. Happy to chat more as well after this. Okay, so let's keep going. I want to go ahead and just frame us for a second. We have all experienced massive amount of trauma, collective trauma, over the course of the last year and a half. And I think it's really important for us to sort of name that ultimately is going to shift how we lead, how we work, how we learn all together as a group. And so one of my favorite authors, Esther Perel, who is a wonderful therapist and speaker, highly recommend her books and her podcast, has a wonderful quote. And I'll just go ahead and read it out loud for those of you, since we can't do participation from all of you today. So despite the necessity of staying physically apart, we have an opportunity to activate the specific type of collective resilience that can emerge when faced with communal, prolonged uncertainty and potential widespread trauma. A powerful antidote to loneliness and fear is purpose, a mantra for these strange times. We are all in this together. I think it's really critical to start from that place when we talk about teacher retention. Ultimately, we're talking about how do we make sure that our school environments are places where people feel like they belong, where they want to be a part of the group and community working to support students, and feel like there's a purpose right behind the broader work that they're doing. So that ultimately, if you take away nothing else, this is the type of environment we're trying to create in our schools. Some quick norms. Please stay engaged, experience this idea of this lack of closure and discomfort that might come up from some of the things we talk about. A lot of these norms come from Courageous Conversations About Race. Highly recommend you read that if you haven't before. We use them for all of our sessions. And then virtually, I know some of these don't work today for this type of an environment, but please, I will say, use the chat. That will be wonderful for me just so that I can hear from all of you all as we walk through some of this content. Okay, so let's get going. So retention bottom lines. I'm going to walk through a couple of bottom lines for you all that hopefully you'll be able to take away. So the very first thing I want to say, ultimately at EdFuel, and we are a talent management nonprofit, so we think about and help schools think about how to ensure that school environments have a really diverse set of teachers, leaders, and staff members. And we do that through equitable and inclusive talent management systems or human capital systems. And so everything we're going to be talking about has to be thought through from a DEIA lens. And so I want to make sure that we're framing this from the perspective of why this is so critical to ensure that ultimately we have a staff that is reflective of the student body that we serve. So thing I will name, so SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, just released a report that talks a lot about and shares a lot of data about what happens in environments when people experience a lack of belonging or exclusion, especially along lines of race. And there's some statistics that they were able to pull from their research, and this is not just in education, this is widespread across the entirety of the workforce, but pulled a bunch of information about essentially how common it is to actually feel unfairly treated in the workplace due to race and ethnicity. And you can see the percentages on the screen here, obviously much higher based off of the background that you hold racially. One of the interesting things they then did was talk through and look at what are the actual impacts here. And as we all would likely know, when you are not actually feeling like your workplace is a place that you feel is a place of belonging and inclusion based on who you are, whether that's racially or otherwise, ultimately our productivity and ways of engaging goes down. And they were actually able to quantify this. So there's actual impacts from the work environment perspective on productivity. And they then quantified that from a number standpoint. So we all talk about this and know about this from a human perspective, right? The impact on all of us as human beings. But I wanted to also share some of that data from a bigger picture research perspective, because some of those numbers actually demonstrate too the true impact, not just on student learning, but on overall our society when we're not approaching it from this lens. So the two questions I want you all to keep in mind as we go through some of these resources and strategies. One, am I, as a leader, reviewing and interrogating my retention data sources with a DEIA lens? And as I consider solutions, am I actually considering them through that lens? How might the decisions that I make actually impact or be perceived by different groups of staff? And that's racially, but it's also, across all lines of difference within an organization. So getting into the bottom lines, let's go ahead and just talk through the high levels. So first, retention is ultimately an outcome, not a solution. So there isn't a silver bullet. There are key questions that ultimately you want to continue to come back to. And one of those key questions is, how do people feel? So you cannot solve retention from one tactic. you actually can get at how likely people are to stay within your organization if you're coming back to that question, how do they actually feel? So you're trying to influence not just people's feeling in the workplace, but also the perception of how they feel. And so this is one of the things we'll talk about when we get into some of the strategies, is how do you actually assess that on an ongoing and really authentic basis, not making people feel like you're just checking it because you want to check the box. Second bottom line, tracking the data. So I recognize we work with tons of single site schools. We work with tons of small organizations with really limited capacity. Believe me, I get it, how hard it can be to actually track ongoing different types of data sources, especially when you've got lots of other data you're trying to collect and manage. That being said, this is what actually allows you to be proactive. So this is going to be what allows you to actually identify the levers that matter. We're going to talk about what are some of those strategies you can use, but I want to name that is a bottom line. To be able to solve for retention, you have to understand it first. And then lastly, identifying strategic solutions, right? So you have to be able to do that root cause analysis that comes out of that tracking of data. And we're going to talk about what those, root causes can be, because there's ultimately a lot and they are very individual, dependent on every person within the organization. But ultimately it comes down to change management and what is ultimately in your control and out of your control. So let's go through bottom line number one, this idea of outcome, not a solution. So we talk about retention as an idea of change management. And many times we see leaders not actually approaching it from this type of a strategy perspective, and more so approaching it from a one-off perspective, which might help with an individual, but actually won't necessarily help when it comes to the collective culture of an organization. So when you think about change management, the idea of change management is this idea of minimizing resistance to organizational change through involvement of players or stakeholders. And that type of definition of change, and then seeing those changes take place with involvement, is what allows people to feel like they're part of an organization. And so when we think about the types of things that have happened over the course of the last year, there's been a massive amount of change. And so ultimately, I hope you all can push yourselves to start thinking about retention less as separate from that change and more about how you've brought people into and through that change, because that's what ultimately makes someone want to stay a part of that organization. So what I'm encouraging all of you to then ask yourselves are making sure to think very meta about what are those key questions as you consider change management. So for example, obviously thinking about how does it impact students, but also who has a seat at the table, who doesn't, right? Those are the types of things that then ultimately can start to increase that sense of belonging. And then the strategies you use, right? So there's examples of how you can do change management effectively. One of the ones we talk about a lot is a cascade, a message cascade. So how are messages being cascaded from the top level of leadership through different stakeholders across the organization? And are you thinking about and doing that strategically, or are you doing that ad hoc? I want all of us to be thinking about what change management practices have you actually successfully employed or considered, especially over this last year. I'm sure there have been a number, some of which probably have been more successful than others. And even the ones that have dealt with other stakeholders, so students or families, what has actually allowed you to bring people to and through that change in a way that makes them feel like they belong? Because that's going to be the same thing you need to do with teachers and staff as they're managing through this next level of change. Okay, second bottom line, tracking data. So there's a lot of different data sources, obviously, that you can use. And like I said before, you'll have access to this full presentation, so no need to, frantically write down anything you see on the screen. But there's tiers of data sources that you want to be thinking about. So obviously the actual retention data you want to be collecting, and you want to make sure that that's also a part of exit interview conversations and stay conversations that you're having with teachers. There are key questions that you can ask related to those exit interviews and stay conversations, like the ones that are on the right-hand side. We also have a ton of resources, templates, tools, handouts. So happy to share those as well. And you guys, can use them as a starting point if you don't already do this in your organization. But tier 2, we get into things like intent to returns. How often you're sending them is a really big driver of how much you know about your staff. We tend to encourage organizations to send their first round of intent to returns assessing where people are falling actually before winter break with another round afterwards, so that you're getting an ongoing and updated view on how people are feeling, especially after big periods of change like a winter break is. And then some of the other things on here, hiring data, obviously, a tracker. So we will talk through some of these more concrete techniques and tools in a second, but want to just name that these types of data collection and analysis practices are ultimately what's going to allow you to then figure out the strategies that are most effective in your organization. And then last, bottom line, identifying root causes. So this is actually TNTP's Insight Pyramid. We highly recommend you all use this. If you don't use Insight, you can still think about the pyramid as it relates to your analysis, but actually asking these questions, right? Of, does your staff actually feel that evaluations are equitable? Do they feel like they can progress in their careers? Do they feel like they're being developed? Those green highlighted questions are ones that we actually have also seen tied in our research to being the most predictive too of whether people want to come to an organization or whether they want to stay. And then with that, there's a lot of different potential root causes. So we put some on here. These aren't certainly all of them, but there's also some aligned resources and strategies along with them. So I'm going to just pause for about 10 seconds, 15 seconds. I'm going to let you just read through this. And then again, you'll have access to the PowerPoint so you can walk away with these later on. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and let you just take a minute to review. Okay, so obviously you'll probably want to take a little bit more time on your own to go through these and to think about how you analyze this within your own organization. And we will talk more about that in a minute when we get into strategies. What I will say though is stay conversations. One of the absolute best ways to actually assess the root causes of potential retention issues is through stay conversations. Conversations where you are sitting down with your staff members and naming explicitly that you want them to to continue working at the organization, to come back with you next year. And so naming that explicitly also opens up the conversation of asking the question, what is it that might make you not want to come back with us, right? And actually having that open conversation then can allow you to understand some of these root causes a little bit better. We suggest then tracking that information so that you can then compile it across all your highest performers and see if there's any trends that emerge from there. Okay, those were the bottom lines. We're going to get into the details now a little bit more specifically. I want to get into how crisis in particular shifts your EBP. This is because, those bottom lines are true whether you're in a crisis situation or not. But across, the board over the last year and a half, there are some very important ways that crises actually pushes the organization to have to think differently about how they deal with retention. I want you all to actually just pause for a second, and I want you to consider a prior time of personal crisis for you. And I want you to think, in that time, how did your priorities shift in terms of what you needed at work? What did you originally look for in your workplace that mattered then less once the crisis hit? And what did you not care about before that suddenly became really important? So I'm going to pause for just about 10 seconds. I actually want you to really think about this, a prior time of crisis and how your priorities shifted. In a second, I'm going to ask you to participate in the chat, but I want you to just think for about 10 seconds first on your own. Okay, hopefully you have something in mind. What I'm going to ask you to do is, in the chat, I want you to share some thoughts on what became most important about your professional workplace during your time of personal crisis. You don't have to share the crisis, but what became important? What became really critical for you about your workplace during that time? And I will say, because of the delay on the recording, I'm going to pause for about 15 seconds, and some of the chat responses will likely come in after I've already moved on. But I want you all to take these chat responses in as people start to give them and think about how that might shift what you actually need and want to do as a leader for your people. So go ahead and in the chat, get your thoughts out. What became most important about your workplace, especially during a time of crisis? And I see we already have some people coming through. Jackie saying support. Yeah, just having support. I think making sure that people feel like their manager, their leader, other people around them just care about them on a personal level. And I know that it looks like Natalia is also naming some things here, having a boss, right, that didn't blame me, right? That's all around that interpersonal connection that I think a lot of us probably feel during that time of crisis. As more people share, I'm actually going to move us forward. I want you to hold that idea in mind, because ultimately, actually, that's exactly what happens organizationally when an organization as a whole goes through crisis. So I'm going to name employee value proposition and what it actually is. Essentially, at its sort of basic level, it represents what you as an organization provide to your employees. We tend to think about it in 4 different buckets: mission and fit, total compensation and rewards, work environment, professional development. And there's a lot of things that go within it. All of what you all are naming in the chat and have named in the chat over the last few minutes relate to these different buckets. But what you can see, especially from the chat responses, is that belief around community, that trust level, the care, right, the flexibility, in crisis moments, that becomes particularly important. So what we tend to see happen, you look to the right side of the screen, that work environment bucket of EVP becomes overweighted in importance, right? Like it becomes particularly critical when you're in a crisis moment. And you all named that in the chat around what matters. So there are 4 components that we like to name when we think about what matters to people during a crisis moment in particular. And those are things like continuity, care, connection, and communication. And those are the things that I'm actually going to dig into with you all as far as strategies go, because that's actually going to be what you want to think most holistically about as you're approaching retention for the upcoming year. Yes, the other things matter. We're not saying they don't, but these 4 components of work environment actually become overweighted in critical importance for people, especially when they're coming back after experiencing a lot of trauma. So I'm going to actually ask you all as I move forward to just in the chat, just so I can get a feel, like what resonates most about that idea, right? About these things mattering most. And I'd be curious to hear too, how have you defined your work environment during this time? Like other than logistics, right? Over the past year, even if you were in hybrid or virtual learning, like what intentional choices have you made around this idea of setting up a work environment towards continuity, towards care, towards connection, towards communication? So feel free to throw those in the chat. I'm going to move us forward as you do, because I want to get to the strategies and I want to make sure we do that before the session ends. Okay, so the good stuff, high leverage strategies. So we're going to zoom in on that work environment bucket. So everything I share right now is going to be aligned to one of those 4 components of work environment. Like I said, there are 4: continuity, communication, care, connection. These are the 4 that we're going to sort of circle on right now as far as those concrete techniques go. So from a continuity standpoint, what we mean by that, ensuring that people are set up to be supported. And that does include compensation, right? But to do their best work under circumstances. Communication, making sure that you're actually sharing timely plans, sharing updates, that people can feel secure, right? That idea of security and safety often comes from feeling like they know what's actually going on. Care, so making sure, and a lot of you named this in the chat, giving grace, lending support, right? People are going to be navigating a lot of different components of personal situations as well as professional needs that might be different this year as opposed to last year even, especially for those school environments that are now going back to full-time in person. And then connection, right? Actually being proactive about how people can connect with one another across the organization. So as we go through these, I want you to be thinking about what mindset shifts are required for you to actually be able to define your work environment in these terms. Like, how do you need to shift your thinking as a leader to be able to do that? And then in addition to that, what has to get communicated to other people at the organization to make sure that this actually sits at the forefront of everybody's minds? So I will say, though, that fourth question, that inclusivity idea really comes out of this. How do we make sure that everybody at the organization feels included in what's happening and understood, right? Feels like they have that sense of belonging, to go back to that. So let's go through each of them. Continuity. So we tend to think about and push our partners to be thinking about this idea of planning for multiple scenarios across different time horizons. Now, you're probably laughing sitting there hearing me say this, because you're probably thinking that's all we did during COVID, right? Plan for multiple scenarios across various time horizons. So hopefully you've gotten somewhat good as a leader about thinking about that idea of what needs to happen now versus what can actually wait. We're going to talk about it in the same way when it comes to continuity. So first, there are two things, I would say statements or questions, that if you surveyed people, having people be able to say yes to these statements means that they experience this idea of continuity in a strong way. First one is, my leadership has a clear plan of action. So in the immediate term, what does that mean or look like? So things like, and these are examples, right? A website landing page or a newsletter with continued updates, high stakes templates, right? That you're providing to people, whether that's to managers or other leaders, ongoing, consistent updates. And so whatever you did during COVID actually becomes equally important now as people are going back and transitioning into full-time physical spaces or into hybrid learning. In the short or medium term, things like resending your intent to return surveys. If you haven't sent one before, sending it, actually assessing through pulse checks throughout the summer, right? Assigning ownership from different leaders at the organization to check in on people, figuring out how they're doing, how are they feeling, how are they coping with some of these longer term post-traumatic reactions that can happen after emerging from a trauma situation. And then in the long term, right? Part of being strong in establishing continuity in the organization is actually setting aside that time with the leadership team to think about that strategically and to make sure that you're actually delivering on those priorities. And most importantly, that you're then sharing with staff how they're going to be informed after those discussions. So those types of strategies and tactics actually become really critical when people are coming back into an environment after experiencing this sort of major change and trauma that they have over the last year. The second question or statement, I should say, that really indicates whether that feeling of continuity is there is this idea of feeling well prepared, right? You want people to actually be able to respond, yes, I feel well prepared to do my job. So your job as a leader, as far as retention goes, is helping to assess whether or not people feel that way. So in the immediate term, this gets to, do staff have the infrastructure that they need? Just ask them, right? Those pulse checks that you do, whether that's calling people one-on-one, whether that's doing a survey, actually figuring out what would make a staff member feel well-equipped, feel better about starting the school year strong. In the short or medium term, actually making sure you're recognizing that people have different learning preferences. So this gets at initial onboarding in August, if you're doing professional development sessions over the summer, recognizing that people are going to have different comfort levels, and to the extent possible, actually differentiating how you're providing some of that information so that people can take it in different ways. And then longer term, that regular feedback. So asking yourself, do I actually have a mechanism to assess this? Is this actually something that is built into our structures as an organization? Because if that's not, that's one of the baseline things that you need to be doing from a retention standpoint. So those are on the continuity front. I want to talk about communication. So again, a statement that you want people to feel and respond positively to is this idea of my supervisor keeping me informed about what's going on. And so this actually can look like a lot of different ways. So formal norms, don't underestimate the power of actually just naming those norms to cascade communication. Have you actually sat down and thought with every decision that's made, how is that decision that is made communicated to the level of people that are going to then communicate it to my broader staff? Because if you skip that step, you're missing an opportunity to buy others in that could help the broader staff actually feel really comfortable and confident in the decision and invested in it. Aligned messaging, right? So FAQs documents or other types of materials that you can use with managers or leaders that are going to be engaging with staff in ways that you might not be. Those one-on-ones, I think, are critical. So making sure that those are actually happening and not being sort of deprioritized. I'm going to reemphasize this over and over again. Stay conversations. If there's one tactic you walk away with, it's that. Having those conversations with your highest performing staff. And then retention tracking. So to what extent are you actually asking your managers to update this information? Do you have a tracker? Do you ask them to share that with you? So what pulse do you have on the organization overall? These are just some examples. This is like an example email of a budget update and timeline that one organization sent to their staff. So just really sharing with them last year what was going on with the budget. This is another one around salary adjustments and promotion. So just this idea of like ongoing, active, proactive communication, that's what allows people to feel like they're kept informed and not in the dark. Okay, I'm going to move us forward a little bit because I want to make sure to get to everything. So care and connection. So these are, other strategies ultimately that that lead to this idea of work environment. On the care front, it's this idea that my organization cares about my well-being, right? And on the connection front, it's the idea that my colleagues actually treat me as a partner. They trust me, right? Trust is the operative word there. Trust ultimately is what leads to connection between individuals, between human beings. And so if trust isn't there, people are not going to feel like they have that sense of belonging. So from a care standpoint, how often are you actually scheduling informal check-ins? This should be a strategic priority for leadership. So this should not just be ad hoc. Leaders actually can be strategic about it in a way that you don't need to name for staff, but that ensures that every single staff member actually does receive that same level of one-on-one attention or individual support. Aligned messaging, so making sure that every time you're working within a group setting, whether that's at an all-staff meeting, a professional development session, have anchoring messages and norms that you keep coming back to, right? Those are the things that are actually going to remind people that you haven't just forgotten about what's happening in the world around them, but that you're constantly thinking about it and keeping it top of mind. Big one that we do whole conversations and sessions about this, but one of the things that's going to be so critical for this upcoming year is around trauma and grief support. This is going to be true certainly at a student level, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking about it on a student level or a family level, but I cannot emphasize enough, this has to be true on a staff level. One of the things that we know from trauma research is that if actually the adult is not able to regulate themselves, we cannot regulate and help regulate a child that's becoming dysregulated. And so it actually is like incredibly important that when you're thinking about trauma support or grief support for your staff, that you're thinking about it through that lens of they actually have to have that level of care so that they can stay centered, they can actually stay regulated such that then they can support the students that they're trying to support. And oftentimes we see in organizations what we perceive of as challenges between relationships with adults and students, or even adult to adult, actually isn't coming from a personality clash. It's coming from dysregulated states hitting against one another. And so this question of how do you regulate becomes really, really important, especially for this upcoming year. And then just ask, right? I've said this a lot, but poll your staff, ask them about what they need. It's going to be different individual to individual, and it's going to change over time. So just asking is frankly a step forward if you haven't already. And then on the connection front, so you want people to feel that trust like I named. So determining people's interest and readiness to actually participate in opportunities to help problem solve. Now, this is a really critical one to really think about, because what we are not suggesting is that you throw additional responsibilities onto staff. However, there are staff members who actually, as part of coping, as part of belonging, as part of feeling productive or purposeful, actually really thrive on being given additional ownership of different things organizationally. Now, this requires staff to actually be able to ask for that and receive that when they do. It requires you to be able to actually know which staff actually want to take that type of a thing on or not, but it can be a really good way to actually build trust, especially for people who feel like they need to have their hands in something to really feel cared for. Acknowledgement, again, this gets at like a really personalized level. So some people really prefer an individual level of acknowledgement, some prefer public, but regardless of preference, the idea of acknowledgement actually is also what builds trust, because it comes down to that idea of, do you see me? Do you see me and what I'm doing here for myself, for my colleagues, and for my kids? And if you can acknowledge that, you're naming for somebody else that you truly are seeing them. And so figuring out those forms of acknowledgement also become really important, especially coming off of a year and a half of really challenging circumstances. And then this idea of building trust, it starts with a leader. If you are not modeling that idea of vulnerability, if you aren't being transparent about your emotions, about the moments when you become dysregulated, about the times where you have needs, your staff are never going to feel comfortable in that power dynamic to do that. So you actually have to take that on as a strategic priority for yourself as a leader. How do I actually establish trust? By being vulnerable about the things that I have actually experienced, that I'm noticing, that I'm struggling with, so that your staff actually can do the same thing. Okay, I want to make one quick note before we end here. So, and this is about management. We could, again, do a whole session on management during crisis. But I did want to just name it briefly through one slide, because it feels irresponsible to not talk about retention without talking about management. Virtual management, I know many of us are going back to in-person full time, but virtual management also has been a major balancing act for people. And I think one of the things we're seeing is there's going to be a real change and potential need to reset expectations coming back in person. And there are potential challenges of going on both sides of the spectrum, right? Of lacking in care or connection and overdoing it on accountability or monitoring, or on the other hand, actually, lacking in accountability and monitoring, overdoing it on the care front. And this is something that is going to be a really individual balancing act for each person, each manager, each relationship with a teacher, with a staff member. But as a leader, one of the things that's really critical is that you are actually needing to constantly keep a pulse or an assessment on the ways that this is happening or not happening. Because we talk a lot about how one of the main reasons why people leave an organization is their direct supervisor. And so if you're actually not assessing that, or you don't have your pulse on where there might be tension between managers and their staff members, you actually you run the risk of major retention problems that come up when you're least expecting it. I also want to name that this is where you're also needing to consider the ways in which white dominant norms might actually be intensified during times of crisis, especially if you're in an organization that is led by a white leader. If you yourself are a white leader, times of crisis often can pull out biases in really sharp ways. And if we're not being cognizant to that, we can't change it. And so having that eye and that insight into the ways that might happen really honestly starts with having a check on yourself as a leader, to have somebody be able to say to you, hey, here's what I'm seeing happen. Let's actually figure out a way to make that different. So I wanted to just name that, especially because I think it's going to be really important as we go back to either predominantly in-person settings or hybrid settings. Okay, perfect timing. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. What I want to do though before we close is I just want to put up a quote. So I'll read it. Again, normally I'd have other folks read it, but with not being able to do that, I'm going to go ahead and just close with this. Not only are we letting top teaching talent slip away, we are literally paying the price for losing them. Estimates for the annual national cost of teacher turnover run as high as $7.3 billion. But more importantly, failure to retain effective teachers is costing students. The difference that effective teachers can make for students is enormous. According to a recent study, students with highly effective teachers are significantly more likely to attend college, make more money over their careers, and save for retirement. As well as, might I add, if I was going to add anything, as well as be healthy, happy, thriving individuals. And so if we are actually not taking care of the people who are meant to help regulate and care for our kids, then we aren't going to be able to accomplish that outcome, which I know is everybody's main goal here. So with that, I will pause. We have about 3 minutes left. You can feel free to chat your questions. I would love to have them chatted, so whole group, we can have everybody see them. If you'd rather put them in the Q&A, that's completely fine. What I will name is the resources, so including the session deck, are going to be posted. I think the slides actually already are. And then for those of you who are interested in some of those like concrete technical resources, what I did was I actually linked as well EdFuel's Talent Playbook. It's a open source resource that includes 5 key plays to setting up really strong talent practices for capacity constrained organizations like single site schools. And that playbook actually has an accompanying Google Drive with resources. One of the key plays is around retention. So you can find a lot of resources, handouts, templates in that Google Drive folder as well. And then as always, if you need me, please feel free to reach out. You all should have my email address on the main presentation page. It's on my presenter profile, but please reach out if you absolutely need anything else at all. With that, feel free, obviously, if you don't have any questions, you are more than welcome to hop out, but I will stick around for these last couple of minutes and answer anything that you want to know in the chat. Wonderful to have all of you guys here today. Thank you so much. I'll come off mute and name the chat comment that was just named about love that money didn't come up. Research has shown a number of things around compensation. We do a ton of work on teacher comp. First of all, I will name that I am the first to say that every single teacher should be making way more money than they are currently. And it's a both and. And one of the things that research and we have found is that ultimately, right, most of us have not gotten into the field for the sake of compensation. We need high compensation to reward us for this incredible work we're doing. And also why we join an organization and why we leave, typically the number 1 and number 2 reasons don't come down to compensation. So it's a necessity, right? And one that from a policy level, all of us would want to change, right? As far as much more funding coming in for teacher pay. And as leaders, we have the power to actually change some of what is in our control around other tactics to make sure we're creating a place of belonging. So it's a both and. Just saw a question come in. Can you speak to differences in retention strategy based on generational? Good question. Yeah, I think actually this is a really interesting one, because what ultimately is true is that the needs are just really different often. So when we looked at, we did a study where we looked at drivers of retention and attrition, what causes someone to want to join or stay. And we actually analyzed the data by life stage. So we asked people optionally, obviously, to provide information on the stage of life they're in, things like, do they have dependents that they care for, either child or elder care? Do they, what's their age? Do they own a home? I mean, number of different factors. Interestingly, we weren't able to find statistically significant differences based on those groups. However, what I will say anecdotally is that people's needs shift over time. So if you have a staff that is primarily younger, has fewer dependents that they're caring for earlier in their career, we've seen in those organizations that the desire at large, right, at an average level, tends to be more towards growth opportunities, professional development, those types of things. EVPs can change over time though, especially if that workforce tends to stay with the organization over time, ends up being in an older stage of life, further in their career, have dependents to care for. Then we tend to see that in those situations, there's a need for additional flexibility. Benefits become a lot more important or named, right, for people. So while we didn't find in that study a statistically significant difference, anecdotally, we have seen that organizations have to be really careful about paying attention to where staff are, because that is going to dictate what they might need or ask for to be able to stay with you as part of an organization. So yeah, good question. It does matter. All right. Well, unless there are any other questions, we are a minute over. So I so appreciated getting to spend some time with you all today. Please reach out if you absolutely need anything at all. Thank you so much.